Johannes Neugebauer from the Institute of Organic Chemistry of the University of Münster, Germany. And the title of his presentation is Electron Densities from Subsystem Density Functional Theory.
Johannes is at the moment professor für theoretische organische Chemie, Organic Chemistry Institute, University of Münster in Germany. He's a chemist by training. He studied chemistry in Germany and also did a PhD there. Then he did postdoc training at Universiteit Amsterdam, Netherlands, and then started his independent career as a junior research group leader at ETH Zurich. It's in Switzerland. Next, he moved to Netherlands, to Leiden University for the position of associate professor for theoretical chemistry, and moved back to Germany. He started with Professor W2 for theoretical chemistry at the Technical University of Braunschweig. He has been offered full professorship at the University of Würzburg, but he accepted full professorship theoretical organic chemistry at the University of Münster, Germany. His scientific interests are development of application of smart quantum chemical methods for selective and efficient calculations on chemical processes in complex environments like solvents, proteins, molecular crystals, or surfaces. He worked on a subsystem-based density functional theory and density-based QM embedding for ground and excited electronic states, and further development of these methods for molecular or spectroscopic properties. He is awardee of many fellowships and awards, and let me mention only the last one from 2016, Dirac Medal of the World Association of Theoretical and Computational Chemists. Johannes, the screen is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. And actually, I would like to thank all the organizers and the organizing institutions for inviting me to give a lecture on electron densities from subsystem density functional theory. Actually, when I was invited to this seminar on quantum crystallography and complementary fields, where I certainly belong to the complementary fields, I was wondering a bit on which part of my work I should focus. But since this subsystem density functional theory is a very, I would say, fundamental type of theory, I decided really to tell you some of the basic work that we did on getting electron densities out of this. So as a motivation, why are we using subsystem density functional theory, and what are we using it for? What is this actually? I will start with some kind of motivation starting from our previous work. We are actually in our group working a lot on excited states, excited states in complex systems. And you see some of the examples of systems for which we built models in the past to study collective excited states of aggregates of chromophore molecules, mostly natural light harvesting systems. So here you see, for instance, the so-called LH2 complex, which is an antenna complex of purple bacteria. Here, this is the LHC2 complex, which is the major light harvesting complex of green plants. And then this is the famous Fenner-Matthews-Olsen light harvesting complex of green sulfur bacteria, which we also used to build models and to study actually excited states of the chromophore aggregates in these systems. But we are also interested in modeling the protein effects and the way in which the protein modifies absorption properties in these systems. Now, just to give you an example, because in the rest of the talk I will mainly concentrate on electron densities and not on excited states. One of the applications that we did already some time ago was to build a model out of this Fenner-Matthews-Olsen monomer complex, which consists in total of more than 7,000 atoms and includes all of the 8 bacteriochlorophyll molecules that form the pigment aggregate framework. in this complex and which are mostly responsible for the absorption properties, in a background of the protein matrix, if you wish, that of course modifies the absorption properties. And then based on TDDFT, linear response TDDFT version of subsystem density functional theory, we were able to calculate the collective excited states based on localized site excitations, you could say, in this chromophore aggregate. And then we can establish actually maps of the excited states, which are shown here for different models that we had. And actually the numbers here refer to the residue numbers of the different bacterial chlorophyll molecules, and the green and blue parts refer to the QY and QX excitations of these pigments. And you see that there are couplings indicated between the different pigments. And actually the color coding here means or gives you the contribution of different pigment excitations to the collective excitations in this aggregate. And the darker the color, the lower the excitation energy, from which you can, for instance, infer that this pigment here has a large contribution to the lowest excitation energy. And this is nicely in line with the experimental results that actually indicate that this is the exit pigment for excitation energy in this light harvesting complex. Now, how does this subsystem DFT work? What is the theoretical basis? Well, all of you are familiar with Cohen-Sham density functional theory, I assume, where we calculate an electronic energy of a total system electron density. This is the way I will call it, based on different contributions. And this is the interaction energy with the external potential, mostly only the nuclei. In our case, the electron-electron classical electrostatic interaction, the exchange correlation energy, and then we have the single particle kinetic energy. And if you think about density functional theory, then this is the term that actually made trouble in the original versions of DFT, if you wish, because when people try to calculate that based on the electron density in terms of, for instance, the Thomas Fermi or von Weizsäcker functional, that failed miserably for chemical purposes at least. And it is much more accurate to use this Cohen-Sham trick, of course, and calculate the kinetic energy based on orbitals that actually, when you square them and sum them up, give you the total energy. So these orbitals are determined, as you all know, by minimizing the energy with respect to the electron density expressed in this way. And then you get Cohen-Sham equations in which you have a local potential here, which actually contains the functional derivatives of these three energy terms with respect to the electron density. Now, the only thing that is different, if you wish, in subsystem density functional theory is that instead of a total electron density, you use densities for fragments. So you express the total electron density as a sum of subsystem densities, and each of these densities is actually given in terms of its own set of orbitals, which are squared and summed up in exactly the same way you would do it for the total electron density in conventional Cohen-Sham density functional theory. And this does not create any kind of problem for the calculation of these three energy terms, if you think about it, at least if you restrict yourself to, let's say, non-orbital dependent exchange correlation functionals. But it definitely is a problem for the kinetic energy, because you simply don't have access to the total system's orbitals. So what is done in subsystem density functional theory is that you write this kinetic energy by adding and then subtracting the sum of the kinetic energies of the subsystems, which are calculated in exactly the way it's shown here, only just on the basis of the occupied orbitals of the different subsystems. Then, of course, you make an error because the sum of these kinetic energies of the subsystems is not the same, not exactly the same as the kinetic energy of the total system. And you have to correct for the error that you're making by just using the sum in terms of this part in green here, which we call the non-additive kinetic energy. And this non-additive part, this is then approximated in subsystem density functional theory in terms of explicitly density-dependent approximations. So there, for instance, you could try things like Thomas Fermi or von Weizsäcker approximations, or other approximations. So there's a whole range of functionals also available here that you can use for this non-additive part. And what you can also say about this is that the weaker the interaction between the different subsystems is, the less work this non-additive kinetic energy functional has to do. And in the case of non-interacting systems, you essentially don't need this term. Now, consider just the case of two fragments, an acetone molecule and water, as shown here as an example. what do? We write the total electron density as a sum of these two contributions. Then we construct an approximation for rho 2 in the first place, keep this frozen, minimize the energy with respect to the density of the active system that we want to optimize under the influence of this frozen electron density. And if you do that in the DFT formalism, then you get an expression in which, in addition to, let's say, the normal expression for the Kohn-Sham potential for this subsystem, an additional embedding potential appears, which contains the electrostatic interactions with the nuclei and the electron density of the environment. And then you have two additional terms, which are called the non-additive exchange correlation potential and the corresponding term for the non-additive kinetic energy. So as long as no approximations are introduced here for the non-additive exchange correlation and kinetic energy parts, this formalism is essentially exact. You have some representability conditions because, of course, you can only find, let's say, a density rho 1 of your active system that allows you to get this total electron density that you would get, let's say, in a Kohn-Sham formalism, if your density rho 2 is at no point in space larger than the desired total electron density. But what you can do is you can do a fully variational optimization of both electron densities. And of course, this can be generalized to an arbitrary number of fragments by exchanging the roles of rho 1 and rho 2, and then doing the same procedure for your environment. And you can do that until none of the densities changes anymore. And then this actually becomes what we call subsystem DFT in the narrower sense of the word. As long as you work just with a frozen density approximation for the environment, this theory is known under the name of frozen density embedding or frozen density embedding theory. And here you see that actually this method goes back in time quite a bit. So there are predecessor methods from the 1980s. And actually, I think the paper that brought this, made it public and important in chemistry was actually this work by Thomas Wesolowski from Geneva and Arie Worschel in 1993, where they had the first application of this. And I would say that in the last 10, 15 years, this field has really exploded and seen a lot of development. And there are two very big overview articles, one by Tomek and one by myself and Christoph Jakob from Braunschweig, in which you can read a lot about, let's say, the initial applications of subsystem DFT and frozen density embedding. Now, if you apply it, let's say, to aggregate of several subsystems, then this would typically work like this. You choose an active subsystem, you choose environment fragments, get an approximation for them, and then you can actually cycle through these subsystems until none of the electron densities changes anymore. And you can construct the total electron density and calculate energies and whatever kind of properties you wish based on the sum of all these fragment electron densities. Now, if you ask about the quality of the results, then let me show here the dipole moment for such a chain of HCN molecules, as I was just showing you on the previous picture. This is a nice example because such a chain of HCN molecules has the effect on the dipole moment that the total dipole moment is highly non-additive because of polarization of the subunits. So if you plot the average dipole moment per monomer as a function of the length, then you see that the average dipole moment increases quite a bit based on such a Kohn-Sham DFT calculation. And if you do the same with frozen density embedding, which in this case actually is a fully polarized subsystem DFT calculation, then you see that this trend is followed pretty closely. So we get pretty close to the Kohn-Sham results for the dipole moments here. And this slight offset, well, you could actually argue which of the two is more accurate, because in this case, the frozen density embedding calculations just use monomer basis sets for each of the HCN molecules, while of course in the Kohn-Sham DFT calculation, you have implicit, let's say, effects of a basis set superposition of all of the monomers. Still, the agreement is, I think, pretty good. The advantage of subsystem methods, of course, is that you directly have a decomposition of all of your quantities in terms of the subunits. So if you look, for example, at the heptamer of this HCN chain, then you can directly extract monomer dipole moments for each of the monomers. And you see that especially at the ends, of course, the dipole moments are less enhanced than in the middle of the chain. And so interpretation and assignment of properties is typically very easy in these subsystem methods. Now, you can raise the question how meaningful these results are, because actually the requirement, the optimization condition in subsystem DFT is such that the sum of the subsystem densities should give you the optimum total density. That also means that once you have found a solution, you could actually add and subtract the same kind of density change function to one of the subsystems. So you subtract part of the density from one subsystem and attribute it to another subsystem. That would not change the, let's say, total system result, but it would change the subsystem results. And so you can raise the question whether in practice the results that you calculate are meaningful or not. And just to give you a little example here, we calculated a dipole moment of a central guanine trimer, guanine molecule in a guanine trimer, and compared the results of subsystem DFT. Well, first of all, with the isolated dipole moment, you see that there's quite a bit of change. But then we also compared it to a dipole moment extracted from a beta analysis of the system. And we saw that the agreement is actually very good. Yeah, so if you would say that the beta analysis allows you to extract subsystem properties, then the subsystem DFT results are pretty close to this. This also holds, by the way, for the direction of the dipole moment, which is indicated here by these arrows. So the black one is actually the one from the isolated system, and the direction of the other two dipole moments is very similar, small angles to the original one of about 4 to 5 degrees. And also that is nicely reproduced by subsystem density functional theory. Actually, one example that we studied quite a while ago with Georg Eikerling. So Georg, I'm very happy to see that you're in the audience, is this FHF minus example. This is already a system where we have a pretty strong interaction because it's one of the strongest hydrogen bonds probably that you can find. So we studied a symmetric system starting from asymmetric fragments. So this is actually a system where subsystem DFT has to work quite a bit. The non-additive kinetic energy functional has to work quite a bit. If you start from an F minus here and an HF molecule on the other side. And if you look at the results, then you could see, for instance, that if you just make a counter plot of the electron density based on the sum of isolated fragments, so F minus here and HF here, then you clearly see an asymmetric result. Almost centrosymmetric in this part here, but with clear signatures of the HF bond on the other side. If you just run a frozen density embedding calculation in a monomer basis, then in this case, this is not enough anymore. The situation, well, is closer to a symmetric picture maybe, but still, you don't recover all the results that you get in a supramolecular calculation, so in a standard Kohn-Sham DFT calculation on this system. In order to achieve that, you have to allow, well, each of the subsystems to get access to basis functions on the other system. So this is what we did in this case, and if you do that with a supramolecular basis, then actually the results look pretty close to this one. But thanks to Georg, we learned that based on just such a contour line plot, it is actually always hard to see differences in the electron density. And what we did then was to use this negative Laplacian of the electron density as a kind of magnifying glass. This again for the superposition of fragment electron densities, where you have this clear centrosymmetric part here. And in the HF molecule, you see these local charge concentrations indicating features of the lone pairs in the HF molecule. Now, if you do the embedding calculation with ghost basis functions on the other fragment, then you can reproduce this also on the, let's say, formal F minus fragment. So you get a symmetric situation also here, which is not entirely identical, but pretty close to the supramolecular result. And that was an indication that for hydrogen bonded systems, actually you can achieve pretty good electron density distributions from subsystem DFT. But what about, let's say, the next level of difficulty? What about subsystems which are connected through covalent bonds? Remember that we get an embedding potential here, which on paper is the exact embedding potential, but it is supposed to be a local potential. And how can we use that to describe covalent bonds? Think about a typical organic molecule, which you partition into two subsystems, a functional group and the remainder of the molecule. In any case, you want to partition through a covalent bond formally. So what do we know about this exact non-additive kinetic potential, which is simply the functional derivative of the non-additive kinetic energy functional with respect to the active system's density? According to all of our experience, the non-additive kinetic energy approximations based directly really on density-dependent expressions break down. And the question then is there any way to reconstruct an exact embedding potential? Let's say, given an electron density for system 2, can we reconstruct the exact embedding potential for system 1 so that the sum of the two subsystem densities actually gives us the correct total system density here? And well, you have to keep in mind that exact in this case excludes the errors that you would also have in a Cohen-Sham DFT calculation on the total system. So in that sense, Cohen-Sham DFT with the same exchange correlation functional is always our reference here. So errors introduced by finite basis sets or exchange correlation approximations, they are excluded here. And we will see in addition that there are problems, numerical issues sometimes when reconstructing such potentials. But at least formally, you can derive an expression that allows you to get such non-additive kinetic potentials in terms of the difference of the effective Cohen-Sham potentials for the active subsystem and the total subsystem. And just to show you one example already, take a look at this ethane molecule, which we have split into an CH3 plus part here and a CH3 minus, which is subsystem 2 in this case. Now, if you do a simple sum of fragment superposition of the electron densities and then plot the density error here, which is integrated over the other direction, so this is just the x direction, then you get for the sum of the fragment densities this black curve here, which is almost hidden underneath the blue curve. And this blue curve is the result from a frozen density embedding calculation with just a simple density-dependent approximation. So in this case, this does not really help a lot. And this really is a frozen density embedding calculation where the density of the second subsystem was kept frozen. If you try to improve that by mutual relaxation of the electron densities, then things actually become worse. Then you get this light blue curve here and the density error is increased. And this is clearly because of the failures of this non-additive kinetic energy potential, which has to mimic orthogonalization effects, if you wish, between the orbitals of the two subsystems. Because we don't have an explicit orthogonalization between the orbitals of the different subsystems. Now, if you reconstruct an embedding potential in the way shown here, then you actually get a density error, which is given by this red curve here, which is 0 almost everywhere. Well, it's not analytically 0, but it's close to 0, except close to the nuclei here, as you can see. Now, how can this be done? I was showing you that we essentially need effective Cohen-Sham potentials that give a specific target density. In this case, we have two target densities. One's the one of the active system and then the total system density. This problem of reconstructing a potential that gives you a certain target density, well, could be called an inverse Cohen-Sham problem, and that has been solved actually several times in the development of exchange correlation functionals, for instance. And there are procedures by Wang and Parr, by Van Leeuwen and Barents, by Zhao, Morrison and Parr, by Wu and Yang, and they are all pretty old already. A couple of years ago, there was another approach to this problem, which was not a reconstruction, let's say, in real space of this potential, but a reconstruction in terms of matrix elements of this potential between basis functions by Emily Carter and a co-worker. And actually, we have made a slight improved version of that in one of our papers. The problem of this matrix form, of course, is, you lose the real space information, and this matrix form is only accurate for the orbitals, for the occupied orbitals, essentially, that you want to study. So electron densities are typically very good if you use that kind of reconstruction, but you cannot use it for other properties, and I will shortly comment on that also on one of the next slides. Now, so how does that work in practice? We have compared a number of these approaches for potential reconstruction in this paper from 2018, and the one that we often use is the so-called top-down strategy. So what we do first is we solve the Cohen-Sham equations for the supersystems. Then we define the environment density, for instance, through an orbital localization. Yeah, and by doing that, we have, by taking the difference between the total electron density and this density of the environment through orbital localization, we have a definition of the density that we actually want to describe in terms of a local potential. Yeah, for this density, we can then run a reconstruction. Yeah, this is the active system's potential, if you wish, that enters here. And for the total system density, where we also need this Cohen-Sham potential, we could either decide to export that directly from a DFT calculation on the total system, or we could also try to use some kind of reconstruction similar to what we're doing for the active systems density here. Yeah. Well, you could say if reconstruction is numerically, let's say, challenging, why should you actually do a reconstruction also of the total electron density potential here? The answer is that we found actually that the errors that you're making here for the active system density and for the total system density do not accumulate, but often they compensate each other in a certain way. So by taking the difference here, these, let's say, problematic parts of the potential cancel out to a certain degree in the non-additive kinetic energy potential. There's a third option, the King-Handy procedure, to reconstruct such a potential based on orbitals and orbital energies, but I'm not going into details about that. Now, let me show you some results for such reconstructed densities for more and more strongly interacting systems that we have included in that paper from 2018. So if you, for example, compare an ammonia dimer and you look at the density error that you're making compared to a dimer calculation, Cohen-Sham dimer calculation, just by superimposing the isolated fragment densities, then you have an integrated density error of about 0.1 electron here. That is, comparatively small if you compare to the errors that we're making for the other examples here, but it can be improved already quite a bit by using a density-dependent approximation for this non-additive kinetic energy parts. With potential reconstruction techniques, you can reduce the error even more, and this gives you a kind of idea about the numerical issues that are still remaining. So you typically don't get to an error of exactly 0, but at least the error is much smaller than with such an explicit approximation. And this becomes more and more important if the interaction gets stronger. So for this ammonia-borane, where you have a kind of dative bond, the isolated fragment superposition is already much worse. So you have an integrated density error of about 0.9 electrons. And even such an subsystem DFT treatment with approximate functionals only brings down this error to about 0.6 electrons. But with reconstruction, you essentially gain one order of magnitude in the quality of the electron density. And everything is even worse if you look at ethane again. Yeah, so in this calculation, we quantified the error, the total integrated density error for the sum of fragment superposition to be about 2 electrons. If you try to do an embedding calculation with an approximate kinetic energy functional, then what happens is that the calculation simply does not converge. So systems like this cannot be treated with a simple density-dependent approximation. But if you do a reconstruction, then you end up with a decent error. Well, you would maybe hope that it's even smaller, and maybe there are ways to improve this even further. But even with our first approach here, we ended up with a qualitatively certainly correct electron density with an error of about 0.16 electrons. And this can also be applied to, let's say, more complex systems, to transition metal complexes. Here we have, for instance, looked at this nickel carbonyl complex with a fluoride ion as a second subsystem. And if you do a top-down double reconstruction in the way I've described before, then you end up with a total density error of about 0.07, 0.08 electrons. Typically, also for systems like this, coordination compounds, transition metal complexes, you would not be able to describe that with a simple subsystem density functional theory just based on density-dependent approximations. And this is something we have seen already much earlier in our work. Now, one question that probably has popped up on the last slides is why should you use this kind of exact embedding at all? It's exact, as I said, formally, because the formal expression for the embedding potential is exact, the numerical reconstruction, of course, has some errors. This exact embedding is expensive because you either, in this top-down approach, have to solve a Kohn-Sham DFT calculation for the total system beforehand. So you could say you have already solved your problem. Why do you bother at all with such an embedding approach? Or, and this is something that shows up if you choose a different approach, which we call bottom-up, and that I did not explain in detail here. There you don't have to do a Kohn-Sham DFT calculation for the total system, but you have to do these reconstructions for a total system density to get total system potentials actually several times. And these reconstructions can also be much more challenging than doing a Kohn-Sham DFT calculation for this. So what are the reasons why people are interested in that at all, or why we are interested in that at all? Well, one benefit, and this is essentially the drive, or has been the driving force in similar techniques in the development of exchange correlation functionals or potentials, is that these exact potentials can actually serve as a basis for better approximate potentials, or let's say also the corresponding energy functionals maybe. But this is only one point. The other point is that we are, for instance, also heavily working on extracting such exact embedding potentials from DFT calculations, which are fairly straightforward even for reasonably large molecules, and then transferring these exact embedding potentials to calculations where you would actually not be able to run the supersystem calculation anymore, like wave function in density functional theory embedding calculations. And we have recently employed that, for instance, in embedding a coupled cluster description of transition metal centers in transition metal complexes in a DFT background. So this clearly is also a kind of application where you can think about constructing exact embedding potentials for covalently bonded systems to simplify, let's say, coupled cluster calculations or things like this. Another field of application are actually calculations where the ground state calculation is not the bottleneck. So if you think about response type calculations, excited state calculations, TDDFT calculations for large systems, then typically the bottleneck will be the response part and not necessarily the ground state calculation of a large system. But as long as we are talking about local excitations, then actually the TDDFT part of the calculation in such an embedded case can be much cheaper, even if you have to do the potential reconstruction before. And if you want to look at one example that we have studied in the past, then in this JCP paper from 2015, you find an application. Maybe I could actually show that these exact embedding potentials improve excitation energies quite a bit. Now, a final comparison. Again, a very simple example that we looked at before, just to give you a comparison of different types of approaches. This is, again, a density error along this axis that you get from a sum of fragment densities. This would be a case where you apply a simple density-dependent embedding approximation. You see the improvement. Well, you would have to go into detail to see that this is an improvement. It actually is an improvement. With potential reconstruction, I think the improvement is quite visible. Only at the positions of the nuclei we have some numerical artifacts, but otherwise this density looks very, very good. And what you see here is you could say alternative embedding approach that has become quite popular over the past years, which is called projection-based or projector-based embedding. And that is essentially a transformation of your Kohn-Sham calculation into a local orbital basis. There you get exactly the same results as in a Kohn-Sham DFT calculation on the complex, but the price you have to pay essentially is also that you have to run a supersystem calculation before. So also there, the main motivation to run such calculations is to transfer the corresponding embedded orbitals and calculate embedded properties or energies into a wave function in DFT context. And we have actually developed the corresponding scheme for excited states. So also that gives you, let's say, exact TDDFT results for an aggregate based on the corresponding subsystem calculations. But I don't want to talk about the excited state calculations in more detail here. I would just like to present you some other problem related actually to a decomposition or a separation of covalent bonds. So there have been in the past some investigations of calculations of protein electron densities. And one of the main findings, and this is actually something that we have also seen in the past, and which is quite painful, is that just running Kohn-Sham DFT calculations on protein structures, in spite of the fact that Kohn-Sham DFT is by now really very efficient also for large systems, can be a pain. And why is that? Because if you're trying to use the efficient non-hybrid functionals, especially with those, then you can get very large density errors, essentially due to the self-interaction error, over polarization effects. And while with hybrid DFT, you can improve the situation, but especially in this study, it was shown that you have to go essentially to these long-range corrected functionals to really get acceptable results. And they are, of course, very expensive in use compared to GGAs and even to standard global hybrids. So what they also indicated was that fragment-based approaches would help. And of course, that raised our interest because we were interested in how good frozen density embedding or subsystem DFT could work for this. The main problem is that you may have charged side chains or end groups, and they can actually also lead to non-converging SCF or incorrect SCF solutions. And this is also something that we have seen quite a bit in computations of large oligopeptide fragments when trying to use GGAs or local density approximations even. I should also mention, and this is something that has been emphasized by Stefan Grimmer, that this problem is less severe if you look at properly solvated proteins. But if for some reason you are studying the structures in vacuum, then it's really a big problem, and often convergence is really dramatically influenced by this error due to self-interaction. Now, there is actually another kind of approach within this family of subsystem density functional methods that allows you to disconnect covalent bonds. And let me briefly introduce that here. The idea is that you partition your total electron density not only in two, let's say, non-overlapping fragments, but that you saturate each of the fragments if you have to cut through a covalent bond, and saturate that with a capping group. Well, this is also being used in several other methods. And then what you have to do in order to compensate for these capping groups is you have to subtract the effect of this capping group. Now, what that means in subsystem density functional theory is that your density representation actually looks like this. You write the total electron density as a sum of these two electron densities, this one, and you subtract this one. So if you wish, this is another fundamental choice of representation of the electron density in a density functional theory. And that had already been proposed in a paper in 2004 by Mark Casida and Thomas Wesolowski, in the sense of using a buffer fragment to treat covalent bonds. Luc Fischer and Christoph Jakob have shown in 2008, however, based on the first implementation of this approach, that if you just do it in this simple, naive way, you could say it leads to a lot of problems. And why is that? The problem is simply if you try to optimize the density represented in this way, what can happen, of course, is that this term leads to regions in space in which the total electron density is negative because the calculation is not yet fully converged or because of accuracy problems, whatever. And negative densities, of course, are a big problem in the calculations. I should also mention that there is a method called molecular fractionation with conjugate caps, which essentially is identical to what's being done here if you do not do any further optimization of the fragment densities. So if you just work with, let's say, fragment densities from libraries, then you have essentially this MFCC density. Now, this is actually also the startup density in this method that is called 3FDE because it's a three-partitioning method. But it is improved on in the subsequent polarization cycles of the different fragments. Mathematically, what you have to do is a constraint optimization of the energy of this total system, where you have constraints, well, first the normalization constraint on the number of electrons in a given subsystem, and then you have a second constraint here, which enforces the density of your active system, and also here you can cycle through the active system, to be identical to the cap electron density, and this is enforced by a Lagrangian multiplier function here, in the regions of the cap. And if you properly do this minimization, then you end up with an effective embedding potential in this three-partitioning FDE, which is the sum of the Kohn-Sham effective potential and the usual embedding potential based on the density of these three fragments in the way I've shown on the previous slide, outside the cap region. But inside the cap region, you use a special cap potential, which essentially can be derived from this Lagrangian multiplier function. So you determine this cap potential in such a way that ρ1, your active system density, exactly reproduces the cap electron density. And the way this is done essentially is also a kind of potential reconstruction. And this was proposed first time in this paper. And still, there were a lot of issues with this method. And what had been missing for quite some time was an analysis of the quality of the electron density and electrostatic potentials. And following this study by Jakob Kongstedt and co-workers, we have actually taken a look at the electrostatic potential that we get out of this 3-FDE in comparison to Kohn-Sham DFT calculations. And actually, you don't have to go to very large systems to see how problematic this can be. So this is a 3-glycine example here, where we actually used range-separated hybrid functional for calculating a reference electron density after we had made sure that this range-separated hybrid gave results in good agreement with approximate coupled cluster electron densities. Now, here you see the errors in the electrostatic potential based on a Kohn-Sham DFT calculation. And green typically means that there is no error. Red and blue indicate errors where the potential is too large or too small. And you see that already by using such an MFCC type of electron density without further relaxation, mutual relaxation, the error in the electrostatic potential is much better. Here you also see the MADs of the electrostatic potential. By doing this mutual polarization in terms of these, what we call freeze and thaw cycles, by changing the role of the active fragments, you can further reduce that. So it looks even greener, and the MAD is also reduced by some amount. But the essential point already seems to be that you switch to a fragmentation approach. Polarization, additional polarization may become more important, of course, if you go to larger protein structures. And the main reason why this is the case is that you really avoid the consequences of self-interaction errors, which will always be present in non-hybrid Kohn-Sham DFT. And I think that everybody who tried to compute electron densities based on local or semi-local exchange correlation functionals for larger protein fragments, especially if you have, let's say, charged side chains, will experience this kind of problem. I would finally like to make a few comments on the calculation of spin densities in this formalism, because essentially subsystem DFT allows you to calculate everything that you can also calculate with ordinary Kohn-Sham DFT. And one of the things that we wanted to use subsystem DFT for were spin densities of organic radical crystals, with a final goal actually of calculating also magnetic exchange couplings. One of the reasons is that also there you have a big problem with Kohn-Sham DFT in terms of this over-delocalization or self-interaction error, because the way in which magnetic exchange couplings are often calculated for, let's say, compounds like this organic radical, this heterocyclic molecule here, is by computing high spin and so-called broken symmetry type of states or Slater determinants, you could say. And by taking the energy difference of these Slater determinants and dividing by the difference in the S-squared expectation values, you get one kind of approximation for magnetic exchange couplings that you can then compare to experimental measurements. Now, in Kohn-Sham DFT, you often see the problem that calculations on the broken symmetry states can actually collapse to singlet ground states. and will not allow you to get the broken symmetry state. And we thought that subsystem DFT could offer some advantages here. And actually you see this crystal here, or the two modifications of this crystal structure that we used as one of the examples. And just to show you that, yeah, there's actually a big advantage with subsystem DFT, we took out a 26-mer, if you wish, from the crystal structure of one of the two modifications. And it is very easy with subsystem DFT then by just assigning the spin per subsystem to converge the calculation to arbitrary microscopic spin patterns, if you wish. So this would be a high spin case, this would be a fully spin compensated total system, and this would be one where you have flipped a few of the spins in some of the monomers in this 26-mer. And that can, of course, be done because the method is very efficient for very large crystals also. So this converges very fast and reliable to pre-selected spin patterns. And well, in spite of the fact that the spin densities are easy to access and very accurate, actually, if you compare to more accurate methods, the resulting magnetic exchange couplings were pretty disappointing at the beginning. So here's the experimental result for the magnetic exchange coupling for these two modifications that I was showing. So the one has a pretty large coupling of 720 inverse centimeter, the other one has 222. And the Kohn-Sham DFT calculation, well, is, I would say, if you have experience with these kinds of calculations, already in the right ballpark. Yeah, so it's only about a factor of 2 for the strong coupling, and this one is underestimated. So it's not perfect, but these types of calculations are not easy, and especially the results are extremely dependent typically on the choice of the exchange correlation functional. So if you would go to a GGA, then the calculations could look completely different. This is actually something that does not happen in subsystem DFT. So I'm showing you one example here for a non-additive kinetic energy functional, also with a PBE0 functional. This is the functional used for the non-additive part of the exchange correlation energy, and this is an acronym for the non-additive kinetic energy functional. So the bad news is that the couplings are severely underestimated. Yeah, you see, not even the order of magnitude is correct. And we could clearly trace this back to the problems in the kinetic energy by taking the energy difference here. The good news is that the results are fairly independent of the choice of the functional that you're using here. Yeah. What you have to do in order to get accurate magnetic exchange couplings is get more accurate values for the non-additive kinetic energy. So essentially also there you need to work with an orbital dependent expression for the kinetic energies, and that can either be done by potential reconstruction, because that gives you orbitals also for the supersystem, and then you actually get results which are in pretty good agreement with experiment if you consider Kohn-Sham DFT as a reference. If you use, by the way, projection-based embedding, you reproduce the Kohn-Sham DFT result essentially exactly. Yeah. We have in a subsequent paper to this Faraday discussions paper also shown that there's a maybe less costly way than this potential reconstruction for getting accurate results here by just orthogonalizing the subsystem orbitals and then working with the corresponding energies, because that eliminates this non-additive part. But I think there a broader benchmark is still necessary to see how useful that really is. Okay, in view of the time, I will actually come to the conclusions. What I would like to mention is that subsystem DFT really is a full-grown DFT variant by now. Yeah, all kinds of properties are available. It is, I think, very helpful for analysis purposes because you get subsystem and supersystem properties. So you have, if you wish, a diabatic and an adiabatic picture for many properties directly built in. You avoid problems due to over-delocalization, and self-interaction error across subsystem borders. Within the subsystems, of course, you have that. Often that is an advantage, but it can also be a limitation. There is a certain limitation if you, for example, want to calculate spin densities that are supposed to be delocalized over several systems. And I, well, unfortunately don't have time to go into more details there, but if you have questions about that, I can answer them. And That also means that you can essentially exploit this limitation here and apply subsystem DFT in a kind of constrained DFT mode, and that opens up completely new fields of application, for instance, concerning charge transfer states, but also the calculation of the broken symmetry states falls into this regime. Now, I would finally like to come to the acknowledgement. I have shown you work of a large number of former group members, which are actually now at other places. So I mentioned the names here, which have contributed to the results I've shown you. The results by Patrick Eschenbach, I could unfortunately not show because of time. He's here on this picture. This is my current group. I would also like to thank the collaboration partners, and I was afraid that I would forget someone, and of course I should have mentioned Georg here. So Georg, please apologize. I was very happy to learn about these density topology analysis tools. What I would also like to mention is that by now all of these subsystem technologies are implemented in kind of group code, which we call Serenity, and you can get it freely on github.com, QC Serenity. Of course, I would like to thank the funding organizations and thank you very much for your kind attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Johannes, for this really great lecture, which is now open for questions and comments. And as I can see, there are already some.
Should I stop screen sharing? Or can you read the questions?
Paulina, can you read the...
Yes, let me read it. So there are two questions from Alexandra. Can we use pre-computed ELMOS to avoid preliminary Kohn-Sham DFT calculations in the bottom-up approach?
In the bottom-up approach of the potential reconstruction. Well, the bottom-up approach is something that I did not explain in detail, but essentially it works like that you compute electron densities for your fragments, and then you use the sum of these pre-computed densities as an approximation for the total system density. For this density, you don't have a Kohn-Sham potential yet, so you have to reconstruct it, and based on that reconstructed potential and the subsystem potential, you can get the exact embedding potential for one of the subsystems. But this is an approach that you have to run iteratively. So using ELMOS, I'm not sure if that could help in the way the ELMOS are defined to get, let's say, better starting points in case you have something like dangling bonds. I could imagine that that could be the case, yes. But it would probably not avoid the necessity to do this iterative treatment, which is often the bottleneck in these calculations. So it could provide a better starting point maybe, and let's say decrease the number of iterations that you need, but it will not probably change the, let's say, order of magnitude of effort. That would be my guess.
Alessandro is further asking, commenting, ELMOS can be also used in projection-based embedding approach to avoid supermolecular calculations. What do you think?
Well, if you use the ELMOS there, I mean, what would be the consequence? Your projector would probably be only approximate, and that could introduce certain artifacts. I'm not entirely sure to which degree that would influence the results. I mean, there is work around Jason Goodpaster, who was a member of Tom Miller's group and is now in Minnesota, who uses absolutely localized molecular orbitals in connection with this projection-based embedding. And but I think in the way he uses it, most often he applies additional correction tricks, especially when thinking about excited states. And this is, let's say, the type of work that I know best of his group. So you would not have the exact projector anymore. This is one aspect. The other aspect concerns the virtual space, because you actually need access to the virtual orbital space in principle also in this projection-based embedding. And this is, let's say, one aspect that is often forgotten in projection-based embedding, even though Manby and Miller always pointed out. The embedding calculations are really only exact in this projection framework if you use the entire virtual space of your total system. And now if you look at the formal scaling of coupled cluster methods, then sometimes they depend more strongly on the number of virtual orbitals than on the number of occupied ones. And the number of virtual orbitals in this projection-based embedding is actually larger than the number of virtuals in the supersystem calculation, because all the occupied orbitals of your environment enter as well as pseudo virtual orbitals, you could say. Yeah? And so if you want to have an efficiency gain there, then you need some kind of truncation of that, of the basis set of the virtual space. But yeah, it's hard for me at this point to see how Elmos would fit in there and what could be expected. It's an interesting idea, certainly, to try to use that.
So Alessandro is further commenting, you can avoid supermolecular calculations if you use Elmos.
Okay, so if that refers to the potential reconstruction, yes, I mean, it would give you another type of reference electron density, but then, of course, you would be targeting also the Elmo density. So if the Elmo densities are, let's say, of sufficient quality, then that could be a good approach. It could certainly help to get, let's say, qualitatively correct embedding potentials in cases of covalent bonds where the, let's say, density-dependent approximations fail completely. This is something I could imagine, yeah. I mean, in principle, you could use, you can use all kinds of reference densities. And Thomas Wesolowski, for example, in his more recent work, has used things like, well, experimental electron densities even to embed molecules into that. Yeah. So there are many choices, and yes, this could be an interesting aspect, but it's then also harder to assess the accuracy, I would say, because you treat the two potentials that you need to reconstruct, or the two densities that you need to construct, on a different footing. Yeah. So you'd use DF for one and the Elmo approach for the other.
Alessandro is further writing, you automatically reduce the number of virtual molecular orbitals because you use only those of the QM subsystems.
Yeah, yes, this is an advantage in terms of efficiency, but you also have to consider that for, let's say, correlated wave function methods, that also means that you're neglecting a considerable part of the correlation, right? And there, of course, well, this is something that has to be carefully investigated, whether you can just simply get rid of all of these virtual orbitals.
Alexandra says, I agree. Michał Chodkiewicz is asking, in which part of molecule an effect of self-interaction is the most visible in electron density?
In which part of a molecule the effect of the self-interaction? Maybe I can use this opportunity to show you some of the slides that I prepared as an appendix. This is actually a study. Well, we did a previous study on this system, a guanine-thymine radical cation, already some years ago. And if you study this guanine-thymine radical cation, what would you expect? You would expect essentially a density distribution as you get from these wave function-based methods here. The guanine has the lower ionization potential, so you would assume that you get the whole, so you get an ionization on the guanine, and correspondingly, you should also see most of the spin density on guanine, yeah? Which is what you see in this CAS-SCF and RAS-SCF calculation. And if you use orbital optimized MP2, then you see that a bit of spin density is actually transferred to the thymine. Now, if you do DFT, what kind of results can you expect? If you use semi-local functionals, you get almost a completely delocalized picture. B3LYP also doesn't help a lot. So you only have a small amount of exact exchange, and that does not avoid this over delocalization. But it introduces spin contamination, as you can see here from the red parts. If you use a long-range corrected function like COM B3LYP, this Y here comes from the fact that we had been working with ADF. So this is what you get from wave function calculations. This is what you get from a semi-local functional. B3LYP doesn't avoid the over-delocalization. COM B3LYP essentially does. Now, if you include a large amount of Hartree-Fock exchange, which gives you problems due to spin contamination, then you get this localization. If you run a frozen density embedding calculation on this, and you, let's say, put the charge on the guanine, then the charge and the spin density will stay on the guanine, even if you allow, let's say, a transfer of spin density to the thymine by putting basis functions here. This is something that we have investigated already 10 years ago. And I think this illustrates one of the typical examples. Yeah, if you have, let's say, the possibility for charge or spin to delocalize, especially to another molecule or another part of a molecule, then by tuning the amount of exact exchange, you can actually produce any kind of spin delocalization pattern you want to have. And we have seen that for magnetic exchange couplings as well. So you tune the amount of exact exchange and you can get arbitrary numbers for magnetic exchange couplings. Now, what is shown here actually is well, a more sophisticated version. Actually, the result of the spin density here is something that you get as a superposition of two embedding calculations. One where you put the hole here and one where you put the hole here, and then you combine the two results in a kind of configuration interaction kind of picture where we work with transition densities for the off-diagonal elements. So this is something that is a bit similar to methods like the multi-state DFT by Giali-Gao or the constrained DFT CI by Troy van Voorhis at MIT. And well, in this way, we can actually describe both localized cases like this one here, or let's say symmetric spin densities as you would get, let's say, in a symmetric setup like a toluene dimer radical cation as shown here. Here, so orbital optimized MP2 and CAS-SCF clearly give this delocalized picture. The RAS-SCF calculation here is not a proper reference. But you see that this FDE diap, which we call this method like, allows this delocalization. And this is what I meant on the conclusion slide, that actually with standard FDE, you would only be able to get these localized pictures, because then the embedding potentials, at least the approximate ones, are typically too repulsive to allow this delocalization, which in this symmetric case is physical. Yeah, but with this approach, you can actually describe it.
Okay.
George is asking or commenting, thank you for the talk, Johannes. Thinking that you now are even able to cut covalent bonds with FDE, could you comment on the meaning of the individual fragment densities one obtains? Do they have a meaning in terms of partitioning?
Well, this is something that I tried to partially answer at the beginning. So if you just have a very fundamental view on this method, then it's only the sum of the densities that should be interpreted, full stop. But in practice, in many of the applications, we see that it is very useful to interpret the results of, let's say, a subsystem, right? And you can employ frozen density embedding just like any other embedding method. But once you go to these exact embedding schemes, it really becomes arbitrary to a certain degree. And especially for this projector-based embedding, you can choose any kind of partitioning and you will always get the same results. We have recently looked a bit at the consequences of this for excited states, right? Where let's say, especially in the context of photosynthesis, people often discuss couplings between local excited states and charge transfer excited states. And of course, the definition of these states in a subsystem formalism depends on the basis, on the choice of the fragments. And there you can see that the strength of these couplings depends, of course, on the kind of diabatization that you apply. And choosing different fragments here, yeah, essentially corresponds to choosing different diabatization techniques. So you have to be careful, and you need, in those cases, you need some kind of, let's say, reference to judge the meaning of your diabatic states or your fragments, if you wish. I think for molecular examples, as I was showing at the beginning, there is not such a big deal, right? If you really have molecules that are separated, then I think it's usually very safe to interpret the results of the subsystem DFT as molecular properties.
I have one question. You mentioned at the beginning large biological system, then you showed many examples on small molecules. What is the largest system or molecules you analyze using subsystem DFT?
Well, actually, the largest ones are, let's say, the light harvesting complex that I have shown at the beginning. So these models, let's say, for this one, we built a model with around 4,000 to 5,000 atoms. For this one, actually, we simulated mutation experiments. So there we had an entire series of calculations with about 1,000 atoms each. This one was about 7,000 atoms. But then our interest switched more to, let's say, targeting the more complicated, covalently bonded fragments. And as I said, so our development directions at the moment are, first, these exact embedding or exact subsystem approaches for excited states and response properties. And the other thing is the wave function DFT methodology. And I should mention that you find all of this in our Serenity program. So I can only, I mean, if you're interested, try to use it for your own applications, and let us know about your experience.
I do not see more questions nor comments. Let us thank Johannes and Alexandro for their really excellent lectures and for these very interesting discussions.